Consistency is often misunderstood as the ability to keep doing something no matter how you feel. That sounds simple, but it leaves out the part that actually makes consistency difficult. Your feelings are constantly changing. One morning, you wake up motivated. You have a clear plan, you feel excited about the future, and the work ahead doesn't seem so hard. A few days later, the excitement disappears. The same task suddenly feels boring. Your mind starts looking for reasons to delay it, and something that felt important on Monday becomes something you can easily convince yourself to do tomorrow. This is where many people begin to believe there is something wrong with them. They start a new routine, follow it for a while, miss a day, and then treat that missed day as evidence that they are simply not disciplined enough. But the real problem is often not a lack of discipline. It is the belief that consistency should feel the same every day. It won't. A consistent person does not wake up every morning with the same level of motivation. They simply become better at continuing when motivation is no longer making the decision for them. That difference is much more important than it first appears, because almost everything valuable in life requires repeated effort long after the excitement has disappeared. Think about learning a skill. The first few days can be exciting because every small improvement feels new. Then the progress becomes harder to notice. The work hasn't necessarily become more difficult, but your brain has stopped giving you the same feeling of novelty. The activity has become familiar, and familiar things rarely produce the same emotional excitement as new ones. This is one reason people can become trapped in a cycle of starting. They are not necessarily addicted to failure. They are attracted to the emotional experience of beginning. A new plan creates hope. A new notebook feels like a fresh identity. A new workout routine makes the future version of yourself seem close. A new business idea creates excitement before the difficult, repetitive work begins. Starting gives you a feeling of progress before you've actually made much progress. Continuing is different. Continuing means doing something after the emotional reward of starting has disappeared. It means opening the book when nobody is impressed, practicing when you're still making mistakes, saving money when spending would be more enjoyable, going back to the task after yesterday went badly. It is much less exciting, but this is where real change usually takes place. There is an interesting connection here with an idea from Aristotle. He believed that people develop qualities through repeated action. In simple terms, you don't become a certain kind of person merely by deciding that you want to be that person. You become that person through what you repeatedly do. That idea matters because it changes the way you should look at consistency. Instead of asking, "How can I force myself to do this every day?" a better question is, "What kind of person am I practicing being every time I do this?" If someone studies for 30 minutes even when they don't feel particularly motivated, they are not just completing 30 minutes of studying. They are strengthening an identity. I am someone who keeps promises to myself. If someone exercises on an ordinary day when there is no excitement around it, they are building evidence that they can rely on themselves. If someone works on a business after the initial excitement has faded, they are teaching themselves that their actions don't have to depend entirely on their mood. Every repetition becomes a small vote for the person you are becoming. This is why consistency is closely connected to identity. When your goal is simply to complete a task, every day becomes a negotiation. Your brain asks whether you feel like doing it. But when the behavior becomes part of how you see yourself, the decision becomes easier. A person who thinks, "I am trying to exercise," has to keep deciding whether exercise is worth doing. A person who thinks, "I take care of my body," is working from a different starting point. This doesn't mean you should pretend you've completely changed. It means you should give your repeated actions a meaning beyond the individual action. There is another reason consistency breaks down. People often make their plans too demanding. They decide that from now on they will wake up early, exercise for an hour, read 50 pages, study for 3 hours, stop using social media, eat perfectly, save money, and completely reorganize their lives. The plan feels powerful because it represents the person they want to become. But the larger the plan becomes, the more effort it takes to maintain, especially when life becomes unpredictable. Then one difficult day arrives. You sleep badly. Something goes wrong at work or school. Your family needs your attention. You are tired. Suddenly, the perfect routine becomes impossible, and because the routine was designed with no room for ordinary life, you abandon it completely. A better system has a flaw. The flaw is the smallest version of the habit you are willing to complete, even on a bad day. Maybe your normal goal is to study for an hour, but your minimum is 10 minutes. Maybe you normally exercise for 45 minutes, but your minimum is a short walk or a few basic exercises. Maybe you want to write every day, but your minimum is one paragraph. The point isn't that 10 minutes is enough to achieve every goal. The point is that 10 minutes keeps the relationship with the habit alive. This creates something important: continuity. Imagine two people trying to build the same habit. One person works extremely hard for 5 days, misses the 6th day, feels guilty, misses the 7th, and eventually stops. The other person has a much less impressive routine. They do a reasonable amount most days, and when life gets in the way, they reduce the habit rather than abandoning it. After several months, the second person may have accumulated far more actual practice. This is one of the quiet secrets of consistency. The best system is not always the one that produces the biggest effort today. It is the one that makes tomorrow easier to return to. Your environment matters here more than you might think. Habits are not created in isolation. The things around you constantly make certain behaviors easier and others harder. If your phone is beside you while you are trying to study, distraction requires almost no effort. If your workout clothes are already prepared, beginning your workout requires less thought. If unhealthy food is always within reach, resisting it requires repeated decisions. You don't have to win every battle through willpower if you can redesign the situation before the battle begins. This is why changing your environment can sometimes produce a bigger improvement than trying to become mentally stronger. A student who puts the phone in another room while studying isn't necessarily more disciplined than everyone else. They have simply removed one of the easiest distractions from the environment. That small change matters because every decision uses mental energy. When you repeatedly ask yourself whether you should work, rest, check your phone, watch something, or start later, you create opportunities to negotiate with yourself. And when you're tired, that negotiation becomes harder. Consistency becomes easier when fewer decisions are required. This is also why routines can be powerful. A routine turns a behavior from a question into a sequence. Instead of deciding every morning whether you will study, you might study after breakfast. Instead of deciding whether to exercise later, you might exercise at the same time each afternoon. The goal is not to create a prison for yourself. It is to remove unnecessary uncertainty. But even with a good routine, there will be days when you don't want to continue. That part never completely disappears. And this is where many people expect consistency to become something almost magical. They imagine that disciplined people eventually stop feeling resistance. Usually, they don't. They simply stop treating resistance as a command. Feeling tired is information. It isn't always an instruction. Feeling bored doesn't necessarily mean the activity is wrong. Feeling unmotivated doesn't necessarily mean you should stop. Wanting to postpone something doesn't automatically mean postponing it is the best choice. There is a difference between listening to your feelings and obeying every feeling. That difference gives you room to act according to your values rather than your mood. Consider someone preparing for an important exam. They have studied consistently for weeks, but one evening they feel exhausted and would rather watch videos. If they believe consistency means studying for 2 hours no matter what, they may force themselves through the session and eventually resent the routine. If they believe consistency means doing absolutely nothing whenever they don't feel motivated, the habit disappears. A better approach might be to reduce the workload. They study for 20 minutes, review a few important ideas, and then stop. The session is smaller than usual, but the person has still reinforced the habit of showing up. This is why consistency should not be confused with perfection. Perfection says, if I cannot do it properly, there is no point doing it. Consistency says, even when I cannot do everything, I can still do something. That difference becomes especially important after failure. Missing one day is not what destroys most habits. The bigger problem is the story people tell themselves afterward. They miss Monday and think, I've ruined the routine. Then Tuesday becomes another missed day because the identity of being consistent already feels broken. But a missed day is an event. It doesn't have to become an identity. You don't need to punish yourself back into discipline. You simply need to return. This may be one of the most useful ways to think about consistency. Measure yourself not only by how rarely you fall off the path, but by how quickly you return when you do. Someone who never misses a day sounds impressive, but that standard may be unrealistic. Someone who misses occasionally and returns quickly can build a much stronger long-term pattern. The same principle applies to money, relationships, learning, fitness, work, and personal growth. There will be interruptions. There will be stressful weeks. There will be moments when your priorities change. Life does not ask permission before becoming inconvenient. A strong habit is one that can survive an imperfect life. And that brings us back to the title, becoming consistent even when you don't feel like it. The answer isn't to become someone who never loses motivation. It is to stop making motivation responsible for everything. Motivation is useful for starting, but systems are better for continuing. Identity gives the behavior meaning. Environment reduces unnecessary friction. Small minimums protect continuity. And the ability to return after a bad day prevents one mistake from becoming a permanent pattern. Over time, something interesting happens. The behavior that once required a serious internal debate starts becoming normal. You don't need to give yourself a speech before doing it. You don't need to feel inspired. You simply begin. That is when consistency starts becoming less about effort and more about familiarity. The person who once had to force themselves to read eventually becomes someone who naturally reads. The person who once struggled to exercise begins to see movement as part of their normal week. The person who once saved money only when they felt responsible starts making financial decisions almost automatically. The habit has moved from something they are trying to do into something that fits the way they live. And that is the deeper goal. You are not trying to win one perfect day. You are building a life in which the behaviors that matter become easier to repeat. You are creating evidence, day after day, that you can trust yourself to act even when your emotions are not perfectly aligned with your goals. There will still be lazy days. There will still be distractions. There will still be moments when you question whether the effort is worth it. Consistency doesn't remove those moments. It simply teaches you that they don't have to decide what happens next. So don't build a life that depends on feeling ready. Build one that makes returning possible. Because the person who changes their life is rarely the person who feels motivated every morning. More often, it is the person who learns how to keep moving through ordinary days, the boring days, the stressful days, the uncertain days, and even the days when progress is almost impossible to see. Those days may not feel important while you're living them, but they are where consistency is built. And eventually, when you look back, you may realize that your life didn't change because of one huge decision. It changed because hundreds of ordinary decisions quietly pointed in the same direction. The strange thing about consistency is that it often becomes hardest at the exact moment when you expect it to become easier. At the beginning, there is usually a clear reason to act. You have a goal in front of you, a deadline, a new idea, or a strong desire to change something about your life. But once the first excitement wears off, the reason can start feeling distant. The reward is still somewhere in the future, while the effort is happening right now. That gap is where a lot of good intentions disappear. This is why the ability to delay a reward matters so much. Your brain naturally pays attention to what feels good or useful in the present. Studying for an exam may help your future, but checking your phone gives you something immediately. Saving money may protect you later, but spending it gives you something you can enjoy today. Going to the gym may improve your health over time, while staying in bed gives you comfort immediately. The choice is rarely between something good and something obviously bad. More often, it is between a small reward now and a larger reward that hasn't arrived yet. Psychologist Walter Mischel became well known for his research on delayed gratification, including experiments with children and rewards. The larger lesson from that work is not that some people are simply born disciplined while others are not. What matters is how people manage attention, temptation, and the way they think about the reward in front of them. The ability to wait can be influenced by the situation and by the strategies a person uses. That gives you an important clue about consistency. Sometimes the problem isn't that you don't care enough about your goal. The problem is that the immediate alternative is simply more attractive. A student may genuinely care about passing an exam and still spend an hour scrolling through videos. Someone can genuinely want to save money and still make an unnecessary purchase. A person can genuinely want to become healthier and still order food they know doesn't fit their plan. The desire for the long-term result is real, but the short-term reward is louder. This is why good habits need more than a goal. They need a structure that protects the goal from your changing moods and short-term impulses. One useful way to do this is to make the beginning of the habit extremely easy. People often focus on making themselves work harder when they should be making the first step smaller. If starting a workout requires finding clothes, traveling somewhere, deciding what exercise to do, and figuring out how long to train, the number of decisions can become an excuse before the workout even begins. But if the clothes are ready, the workout is already chosen, and the first exercise is obvious, there is less room for hesitation. The difference may seem tiny, but habits are often shaped by tiny differences in effort. This is sometimes called friction. Friction is simply anything that makes a behavior harder to start or continue. You can add friction to behaviors you want to reduce and remove friction from behaviors you want to increase. If you want to read more, leave the book somewhere visible and keep your phone farther away. If you want to stop spending so much money online, remove saved payment details or make unnecessary purchases harder to complete. If you want to practice a skill, keep the tools you need ready instead of putting them away where starting becomes another task. You are not cheating by making good behavior easier. You're designing the conditions around yourself. And this is one of the reasons highly consistent people can sometimes look more disciplined than they actually feel. Their environment is doing part of the work for them. There is a common mistake in the way people talk about self-control. They imagine that the strongest person is the one who can stand next to temptation all day and repeatedly say no. But there is no real prize for making life harder than necessary. If two people want the same result, and one constantly creates situations that tempt them to fail, while the other removes those temptations in advance, the second person has built a smarter system. Consistency is not always about stronger resistance. Sometimes it is about fewer things to resist. This becomes especially important when you are trying to break an old habit. Bad habits often survive because they have a predictable trigger and a reliable reward. Someone feels stressed, reaches for their phone, and gets a quick distraction. Someone feels lonely, starts messaging people who make them feel wanted, and gets temporary emotional comfort. Someone feels bored, opens an app, and receives an endless stream of novelty. The behavior may look irrational from the outside, but from the brain's point of view, it is solving a problem. That doesn't mean the solution is healthy. It means that if you want to change the habit, you need to understand what the habit is doing for you. This is where many attempts at self-improvement go wrong. A person sees the behavior and attacks the behavior without understanding the need underneath it. They say, "I need to stop scrolling," but they never ask what happens before the scrolling begins. They say, "I need to stop procrastinating," but they don't examine whether the task feels confusing, overwhelming, boring, or connected to fear of failure. Sometimes procrastination isn't laziness. Sometimes it is avoidance wearing the clothes of laziness. A person may keep delaying an important task because starting it would force them to discover whether they are actually capable of doing it. As long as the task remains unfinished, they can still imagine that they could have done well if they had tried. Finishing removes that protection. Once you understand the emotional purpose of a habit, changing it becomes more practical. Instead of simply asking, "How do I stop doing this?" you can ask, "What am I trying to get from this behavior, and is there a better way to get it?" That question can reveal things you wouldn't see by focusing only on the habit itself. A person who constantly checks their phone may not simply have a phone problem. They may be uncomfortable with silence. Someone who constantly seeks approval may not simply enjoy compliments. They may have learned to depend on outside reactions to feel secure. Someone who keeps buying things they don't need may not simply be bad with money. Shopping may be giving them a brief feeling of excitement, status, or escape. The habit becomes the visible part of a deeper loop. Once you can see the loop, you have something you can actually work with. But there is another trap that deserves attention: relying too heavily on tracking. Tracking can be useful. Seeing a chain of completed days can create a sense of progress. A calendar filled with marks can make a habit feel real. But tracking can become dangerous when the number becomes more important than the behavior itself. Someone misses one day and feels like the entire month is ruined. They become more focused on protecting the streak than on understanding why they are building the habit in the first place. A streak is a measurement, it isn't the habit. If you need to miss a day because you're sick, traveling, exhausted, or dealing with something genuinely important, the goal should not be to panic because a number has been broken. The goal is to return when you can. This is another reason identity is so useful. If your only goal is maintaining a perfect streak, one mistake can make you feel like a failure. But if your identity is built around being someone who returns, then a mistake becomes part of the process rather than the end of it. There is strength in being able to say, "I stopped for a while, and now I'm starting again." That sentence sounds ordinary, but it describes a skill that can change a person's life. Because eventually, consistency becomes less about never falling off and more about shortening the distance between falling off and coming back. A person who has been exercising for years may still have weeks when they do very little. Someone who has studied for years may have periods when they lose focus. A successful business owner may go through seasons when productivity drops. The difference is that these interruptions don't automatically become permanent. They know how to restart. And restarting is easier when you don't attach shame to it. Shame often makes habits worse because it creates another painful feeling that the brain wants to escape. A person misses several workouts, feels guilty, avoids thinking about fitness, and then avoids the gym because going back reminds them of their failure. The original problem was missing workouts. The new problem is the emotional weight attached to returning. A healthier approach is more practical. What happened? What made the habit difficult? What can be changed? What is the smallest step that gets the routine moving again? That approach turns failure into information. This is one of the biggest differences between a rigid system and a flexible one. A rigid system assumes the person will always have the same amount of time, energy, money, focus, and emotional strength. A flexible system expects real life to interfere and has a plan for those moments. That doesn't mean lowering your standards until they mean nothing. It means building a system that can survive reality. If your normal workout is an hour, your backup plan might be 20 minutes. If your normal study session is 2 hours, your backup might be 30 minutes. If your normal writing session is 1,000 words, your backup might be 200. The backup plan is not the goal. It is the bridge back to the goal. And sometimes that bridge is exactly what keeps a temporary problem from becoming a permanent habit of quitting. There is also something else happening underneath all of this. Every time you keep a small promise to yourself, you collect evidence about who you are. That evidence matters because confidence doesn't only come from positive thinking, it also comes from experience. If you repeatedly tell yourself that you will do something and then don't do it, your mind notices. Eventually, your promises begin to lose weight. You may still say, "Tomorrow I'll start," but some part of you has learned not to take the statement seriously. The opposite is also true. When you repeatedly do what you said you would do, even on a small scale, your trust in yourself grows. You don't need to convince yourself that you're disciplined. You have evidence. That is why consistency can quietly change confidence. Not the loud kind of confidence that tries to prove something to everyone else, but the calmer kind that comes from knowing you can rely on your own actions. And once that begins to develop, something changes in the way you approach goals. You stop needing every new goal to feel exciting. You become less interested in the emotional high of starting and more interested in building something that lasts. The goal stops being to impress yourself for a week. It becomes to become dependable over years. That is a much more powerful standard, because your life is largely shaped by things you repeat when nobody is watching. The way you spend ordinary evenings, the food you usually choose, the way you respond when you're stressed, the amount of time you give to your phone, the promises you keep, the work you return to, the conversations you avoid, the skills you practice when there is no immediate reward. None of these moments feels dramatic by itself, but repeated often enough, they become your life.